Hi guys. I hope you're all doing well. And we're going to build off of last week's lessons with our research paper. And by now, you all have already done your self checklist for draft number 1 for your research paper. And you should now be able to use that to revise for draft number 2, which is going to be due Wednesday at 9:30. Okay, so using that self checklist, if you circled anything that was no, or that you didn't include in your paper, you should go back and revise that because that checklist is based off of the rubric and using my feedback that I either type to you or I send a video of feedback where I was looking for your citations and looking at your quote weaves and your like in-text citations. So you should be using that to do draft number 2, which is due later this week. Now, what I'm going to do right now, guys, is using the requirements that you see right here for draft number 2, which I lectured on Friday. I'm going to show you what these actually look like in practice in the student example of that poaching student example that we have looked at since the beginning of our research unit. Okay, so here we have our student example of their final draft of their research paper. And you can see on this side, I have like my little annotations that will hopefully guide your learning as well. But the things that we're looking for are going to be those draft 2 requirements in particular. So we've already gone through and talked about how they had an attention getter that motivated the reader to care by painting a picture of that problem. They also had a specific audience that they were addressing, like when it says you, because you can use personal pronouns in your writing, as long as we actually know who are you like talking to. Is it the parents? Is it people who are in like a suburban area poaching? Is it teenagers who are affected by the problem? You have to have a specific audience in mind. I'm not going to go through and read all of this because a lot of this we did in our first draft and you guys already had it. So we're not going to read through it all together because we've already done that in class. But a few things I'm going to point out that I like that they did in their second draft, or that you can do for your second draft and eventually your final draft, is that every once in a while they use italics to emphasize their certain points. So the fact that they're adding on to this list, they want to emphasize that the list continues. So they emphasized a single word by italicizing it. That's something that we've also talked about. Another thing that I was looking at in your first draft was that you were using your quote weaves and you were building your source trustworthiness, the source credibility with those quote weaves, just like they did here. That's highlighted in like purple. And that you're using a variety of different types of quote of using, what do we call it? Presenting your evidence in various ways. So you use direct quotes, paraphrasing, and summarizing. I gave a lot of feedback on it, and you can see over here, I made some notes on the student example about how they had their quote weave, that they were name dropping a well-known reference or like a well-known source. And, oh, that's me. Their evidence, they use direct quotes and they paraphrase. I know I made a lot of comments on student examples about paraphrasing, that you have to cite paraphrase information if it includes data. So statistics, numbers, things that I know that you did not come up with. It's somebody else's idea that you're like stealing, that you're borrowing. You have to put it in an in-text citation, even if it isn't a direct quote. Okay. Now, as we are looking at page 2, this is page 2. Some things that they did really well that I wanted to point out is that they used a variety of quote weave styles. So the bottom of page 2 here, I wanted to show you that they used a complete sentence with a colon correctly. So this whole thing right here that's in purple, this is all of like their quote weave basically, because they're establishing their source credibility. It says a telephone interview with an employee at Willowbrook Wildlife Center, a center that administers rehabilitation for injured and sick wildlife animals, provides insight on this exact subject. So this is technically part of their quote weave because they are building the credibility of that source. They're explaining where they got their information and like why that's a credible place to get information because of the center and what their work does, because it revolves around this topic of poaching. And then Willowbrook Wildlife Center is located in DuPage, Illinois, a highly suburban area. They had to give that context because they're talking about suburban poaching in this section. The interviewee describes the animal she sees come in most often with injuries resulting in suburban poaching or resulting from suburban poaching. And then they have a colon here because that could be a complete sentence, but it's actually introducing their quote. So it is a quote weave. So if you could replace this with like a period, then you know it's correct, but it cannot be a period, otherwise it's wrong. Okay, so that is using a complete sentence with a colon to then introduce the direct quote. So that's one way that you can have a variety of quote weave styles. The next one I want to look at is going to be on this third page when they do an incomplete thought and just like seamlessly weave it into a quote weave or into a direct quote. Let's see. Did I make an annotation? Or did I just find it? Let's see. Thanks, guys, for your patience. Where do we see the direct quote? Let me pause this. Okay, here is where they use an incomplete thought to seamlessly weave in their direct quote. So it says, as author Brad Schreiber from National Geographic says that in recent years, poachers have perpetuated mass killings, yada, yada, yada. So do you see here that there's no comma because it isn't like a speaker tag necessarily. Instead, it's a complete, with the direct quote, it becomes a complete sentence. Okay, so that's another example of it. And this was at the bottom of page 3. And then I'm going to jump to page 6, where our student example uses a speaker tag with a comma to correctly use a quote weave. So do you have here where it says it states, it says Stephen O'Brien, a professor at the College of Natural Science, states traditionally the punishment for poaching, and goes on and on and on. Okay, so we have 3 different types of manipulating like the evidence or having a variety of the quote weave styles here. And then you can even see, this was one of our other things in our second draft that we're trying to do, that we did a quoted in. This is where it says QTD and then in, and then this was the source that it is actually from. So this is what it will look like. Honestly, I don't care if it's like capitalized, like some of them are not capitalized. It can be lowercase q, lowercase I. I'm not going to be like that stingy on it. But this was one of the ways that you can manipulate evidence to be more efficient. One of the 4 different ways that we talked about on Friday. So I'm going to keep kind of jumping around like this since I'm near page 5. I'm going to show you the block quote. Look at that. Okay, here we have a block quote, guys. So you can see here that they introduce the block quote and the punctuation before it must be a colon. And then you have to indent 2 times. So you can see up here, this is just indented 1 time, or when you press tab once. This is when you press tab twice. The entire thing has to be aligned on that left side twice, or like indented 2 times, in order for it to actually look like a block. And you can do that for anything that's like 4 lines or longer, but you can only do 2 block quotes in your entire paper, okay? The weird thing is that they changed the MLA citation on us. You don't put any quotation marks around the entire thing to show that it's a quote. Instead, the block formatting is what shows that it's a direct quote, that these are not your words. You just would use quotation marks like they do here within the quote, just like you see it on your like source or within your like web page or whatever it was. And then they throw you for another loop by putting the period for the indirect citation on the inside instead of the outside, like we do every other citation, because they like to mess up how we have things going. Okay, thanks MLA citations and MLA formatting and MLA and the Modern Language Association, screwing it all up for us. Remember, you can only have 2 of those, okay? And right after the block quote, you should still explain the evidence and start to analyze it just like you would any other direct quote, except you do not indent right here because it's not a new paragraph. This is all, you think of it as all 1 paragraph still, because it's explaining this direct quote. So you only indent when you're coming to a new idea, you want to start an actual new paragraph, okay? So that is our formatting for a block quote. Let's look at other things that we said we could manipulate evidence on page 5. On page 5 here is an example of how they use brackets. Oh, okay, within that block quote right here. They use brackets to add clarity to this direct quote. Remember, you use brackets whenever you are changing or adding something to a direct quote, and it's usually for some sort of like pronoun. So when they said they in this direct quote, it's like, who are the they that they're referring to? And they're reminding the reader that the they that they're referring to is elephants. So it adds clarity for the reader. And you can do that with like a word or a few words or like a phrase, but you can't add like full sentences to your direct quotes within brackets. Okay, so keep that in mind. So far we've talked about brackets, a quoted in, and then the source, and then the block quote. And then the other one that you can use to manipulate evidence, and you have to do 3 out of these 4, is use the ellipse or the ... So on page 3 here, I think they omitted something in one of their direct quotes to cut out something. Okay, like right here, that wasn't necessary. So in this direct quote, it started to get like a little bit long, especially because this was an interview, I believe, if I'm correct. Yeah. So this was that same interview from the Willowbrook Wildlife Center. So I'm sure that they ended up whittling down like a lot of their interview, and this is telling us that they like took out a bunch of non-essential information, but yet they're still keeping the direct quote from like this author or this person that they interviewed. So that's one we've talked about before many times. You don't have to do it at the beginning of a direct quote or at the end of the direct quote, only if you like cut out things in the middle. And guys, I noticed on your first drafts, a lot of your direct quotes were super long, and probably some of that could be like omitted. You could probably get rid of a few of those sentences in the middle of it in order to make it like more efficient and more precise. So this is one that you can use pretty often. Okay, so for draft number 2, we've already talked about manipulating. Let's actually look here. We've talked about manipulating evidence, and you have to do 2 out of these 4. Then we've already talked about the variety of quote weave styles. You must do all 3. So you have to do a complete sentence with a colon, an incomplete thought that just naturally goes right into the direct quote, seamlessly does that, and then the speaker tag. I'm going to show you a few examples in the student example of where you can add voice and academic writing with your figurative language and creative comparisons, reiterating the author stance, and then just that like sentence construction as well. Okay, so let's jump back over here. I feel like I'm winded. It's because I have not been working out like usual. Okay, page 5. Okay. Page 5, they end up adding some figurative language or creative comparisons, like right here. Oh, I even labeled it. How nice. Think of each ecosystem on Earth like a chain of dominoes. Push one species over and the entire ecosystem tumbles as a result. That is beautiful. Guys, just because you're writing, like an argumentative research-based paper doesn't mean it has to be like super dry and extremely boring. I can actually visualize the impact now, or like what this is, what they're trying to prove, that like this is actually really, really important because we're all linked together, just like dominoes, and that things are going to tumble. So it kind of makes it more dramatic and it makes it more fun to read. They also do this later on the same page when they said something like spreading like a disease. I could read this whole thing again out loud to you, but I feel like that would be super painful for all of us. But that would be another great way. Oh, right here. Yes, so it's spreading like a disease, all because a single animal was removed. Again, they're reminding us of their stance too. They're always saying that like this is awful, that they are on the con side. They are con or against poaching. They're always reiterating that like this is wrong, this is negative, this is bad, by reminding us of their stance that they had in like their claim. So they're constantly like reiterating that. They even say it here, like it's a serious punishment, or like poaching has serious punishments, but it still rages on. It doesn't just like trickle on. It just doesn't occur, but it rages. Like that's an angry, aggressive word to reiterate their stance. And you can do that with different like word choice and adjectives, just like they did there with the rages on. I love that. They call it like, like a crime, not just like it's something that happens. It says a grim future here. Again, it's not just like, oh, this is bad, but that uses stronger diction in order to reiterate their stance. So I really like that we do that throughout because it makes it more fun to read because it's more dramatic, and it makes you seem very consistent and sure of yourself as a writer with your not just your stance, but with your like belief. And then our sentence construction, just making sure that it doesn't get like redundant, like do-do, 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 do-do. When you're reading it like out loud, you want some sentences to be long, some of them to be shorter. You could add emphasis to like a really important point by having it be like shorter than the rest of them because it would stand out. You could do like a dash and then get to your point. Just think about what we did in our first few units with like our narrative writing. And that was with like memoirs, but when they wanted to make their point, they would like change up the structure of their sentences to make it like stand out or to really grab your attention or to add emphasis or have different punctuation to offset it from everything else. Okay, those were the main ones that we were talking about right now. Oh, and then last thing I was going to show you for right now, since this was our second draft requirements, let me double check. Yeah, we just talked about voice and academic writing, was having the works cited. Okay, so you have to have your works cited this time. You can also include on your second draft the works cited and the bibliography, because that's where you're going to need for your final draft, your works cited and your bibliography. But your works cited is going to be different than the bibliography because it's going to be shorter. I mean, that's the honest truth, because these are only the sources that they use within their actual writing, within their paper. So they actually use quite a few, but those are all the ones that they like referenced within an in-text citation. And I got a great question from a student emailed to me earlier this week. They were asking, like, how do I format the works cited? Like, how do I list them out? They're like, is it listed in the format that I use, like that I come across them in my writing? I said, no, it is just alphabetical order. Okay, so it's like the same order as your bibliography, except you're just cutting out all of the sources that you didn't actually reference from like the bibliography. So you'll have your works cited. So these are all the things that they actually used within their paper. These are all the sources they actually used. And then below that, if I keep scrolling, you'll also have your bibliography. So this is everything they actually researched. This is everything from like noodle tools that they ended up maybe not necessarily using, but it will be repetitive. Like it will be redundant. Like you will have the same sources in your works cited as you will in your bibliography, but then your bibliography will also have everything that you didn't necessarily cite, but you read during your research or made note cards with. Okay, guys, I think that's all for now. This might have been a little bit repetitive, but hopefully it's helpful. You can always just go back and read through this student example on your own to get some more ideas, and I'll try to post a few other helpful hints as you guys are working on your second draft. Okay, we will talk soon. Goodbye.